So hello again, everyone. My name is Rafferty. I work for Microsoft. Currently, I'm in a team called Microsoft Technology Center as one of the architects here. And today, the topic is about DevOps on Azure or Azure Hybrid Cloud. Now, just a little bit more about me. Even prior to being an architect, I've worked with a lot of delivery software application development projects, doing a lot of waterfall or agile projects. A lot of people, right, very interested in DevOps, and I'm sure the audience here has coming from different places, right? Some of you may be interested in this session today, maybe because you wanted to improve software quality, faster time to market is a common one. But some, maybe the more techie guys here are really just wanting to learn more engineering practices, more how do you improve the way you do today, the things that you do today, right? So these are some of the common aspirations. These are not from any online stats. This is basically a lot of the questions that customers who come to me have been asking about. Um, and so before I even talk about DevOps, I just wanted to introduce you to this concept called developer velocity. Now, developer velocity is a term coined by McKinsey, and they basically conducted this study about the digital transformation and how many organizations today are working on how to transform their businesses, right? And what they interestingly found out is that the more you pursue digital strategies, no matter what industry you are from, even if you are not in tech, but doing some type of digital transformation, more and more you need to act like software companies. And that is because they have found that the uh, more companies learn the ways that software vendors do, right? Their developer velocity increases, and then there's a direct correlation to the business results. Because again, faster time to market, being able to produce products, being able to offer new products to the customers, all of this, right? Now there's a strong software capability component for you to deliver this type of business results. So what they found, and there is an online assessment. Okay, so what I was saying is that as more companies adopt the developer velocity, right? What they found out is they had 4 to 5 times more revenue growth and 55% more innovation, right? And I was sharing earlier, you can go to this website called developervelocityassessment.com, and that is where you can um, do an assessment for yourself, for your organization, and you will have a what they call DVI, Developer Velocity Index, and it will benchmark you against different companies in the same industry, and it will tell you where you are, right? So it's quite an interesting assessment. Now, this concept of developer velocity looks at many different areas. Given that the topic today is cloud or not the cloud, right? You will see here that cloud is really a big part of developer velocity. How much you're adopting the public cloud, how much you're using infra as code, and of course the architectures that come with it, whether it be software or hardware. That is a big part of it. But if you look at it, a lot of the points here are in relation to DevOps or DevSecOps, testing automation, tooling, AI assistance, CI/CD practices, code reviews, technical debt management. All of these are kind of related to either agile development or DevOps, right? And then there are also areas about security and culture, right? Culture is very important. How do you collaborate? Is there a engineering career path within your organization? Are you an organization that attracts technical talent, right? Whether you're not, even if you're not a software company, you should be able to attract uh, high technical talent within your company. And how do you do that? And of course, there's other parts about collaboration. About there's this idea now about giving having that level of parity between co-located and remote work, right? So now that many people are working from home, hopefully your team is as productive as it was even when you were all in the office. And how do you do that? How do you use technology, and how do you change the culture and the way you collaborate so that everyone's very productive? So everything here is all part of developer velocity. Now, our focus today is that we'll zoom deeper into DevOps, right? For those who in the audience who don't know, right, DevOps is really the union of people, process, and products. So dev, of course, developers, and ops is operations. And the idea is there's a union. There shouldn't be a wall between these two teams, which is typical for many organizations. And how do you use that unity and integrate it in your process, and even in the tools that you use, right? So this is DevOps. Now, oops, sorry, wrong animation here, which I wasn't able to remove. But yeah, so DevOps. I, Now, before I go into this slide, there's something that I needed to clarify. There is a Microsoft product for DevOps tools, and that is called GitHub, right? So you see in the diagram here, is a GitHub logo in between, in the middle, right? And GitHub is something that you can use for your CI/CD, for your source control repo management. You can use GitHub Actions for deploying to any cloud, right? Even for on-prem to Azure and even to other clouds, you're able to use GitHub. You are not constrained to just use Azure. You can deploy to any cloud, right? So this is what you call a DevOps tool, right? There are many tools out there that can do something similar, right? And that's where you kind of compare the features and the capabilities of these tools. Now, I wanted to touch on this a bit because our topic today is about DevOps on Azure. So there is an area where it's about DevOps tools, and you can call it Microsoft DevOps tools or Azure DevOps tools, right? Whatever you call it, it's a product, right? To help you implement CI/CD, source control management, all of these things. Now, DevOps on Azure, on the other hand, is Microsoft Azure, and what are the DevOps capabilities embedded within Microsoft Azure. So this something like this may have been presented by some of my colleagues in the previous sessions, but Microsoft Azure has a lot of different services, right? There's the infrastructure as a service. Uh, Capabilities about virtual machines, networking, load balancers, storage. There's the serverless computing, right? About app services, containers, Kubernetes, right? And there's also the edge devices about Azure Arc, Azure Stack, if you've heard of it, right? And what we try to do from a developer point of view is that all of these will have the same consistent developer toolchain. So that could be Visual Studio, that could be GitHub, that could be some of you may have been using VS Code, right? Power Platform. There's also like Azure CLI, Azure Storage Explorer. All of these, right? If you use an Azure Storage Explorer, for example, you can use it for an Azure Stack and for the Azure Public Cloud, right? So that's at least from a skill set and engineering point of view. You don't need to have two different tools, two different skill sets when you're engaging with these different services. Now, I just put it here. This is just one level deeper of that previous slide. From a serverless computing standpoint, there are a lot of Azure services. There's a lot for the app space, like Kubernetes is the one of the famous ones, right? We also have similar to some of our panelists here, right? We have Azure, Red Hat OpenShift, and then we have Spring Cloud for those who are using Java. Those are some of the managed services that are, or managed instance offerings that we have in Azure, right? But we also have other things like the operational databases that are offered as a PaaS, platform as a service, Azure SQL, Postgre, MySQL, MariaDB. We also have the integration services and the AI. But anyway, our session today is not about discussing all of these things. Our discussion today is about DevOps, right? So let me start opening my. Now I know what's wrong with my mic while I'm doing this. Okay, so let me show you this one, right? So what I'm gonna do today is that we have a lot of different Azure services, and some of them will have different ways that you do DevOps on. This is, I just nitpicked on this one, right? This is called Azure App Services. It is a nice, it's a service, basically a service where you put your websites on, right? It supports Windows based and Linux based apps, web apps, and you can deploy either .NET, Java, PHP, Node.js apps, containers as well. You can put them in there, in here, right? And in this app service, actually, let me open this one first, right? So if you look at this app service, yes, you need to learn how do you create one, how do you deploy manually, right? But what are the DevOps capabilities in a in a service like this? So if you look at deployment here, you will notice that we have something called deployment center, and a lot of our services have this option. Um, Depending on the service that you use, we always think of DevOps, and we basically give you some level of DevOps capability, right? So for example, for app service, you will see that in the source, you will see that you can quickly configure it to connect to either Azure repos, to GitHub, to Bitbucket, to a local Git. You can also kind of just type in your external Git URL if it's not in any one of these options. You can even connect it to a folder in OneDrive or Dropbox. But of course, this is kind of rare. Um, but if you look at this, right, if I click on GitHub, I can click authorize and it'll prompt me to log in to GitHub. It'll ask me for the repo that I'm working on, right? And when I basically go through this entire process, it'll automatically generate a GitHub actions in my GitHub organization, in my GitHub project. And it will basically give you at least an initial template for that CI/CD, right? So this is my other application. In this case, I kind of integrated with another DevOps platform called Azure DevOps. And you'll see here that when I integrated with Azure DevOps, um, uh, it automatically basically created a pipeline for me, and it even looks at the deployment history, right? What did I do as I deployed to this particular app service? And you can see I can click here, it will lead me to my repo, right? And I could sync if I want to get some data, right? So the nice thing here is, if I am an operations person, right, I wanted to look at, I typically will only look at the Azure portal. I will not look at my developers or my teammates repository, right? I can see from here the latest status of the deployment and what we have been doing without even going to that particular DevOps tool. Okay, so this is one of those samples of DevOps capabilities within Azure. There are a lot more here. For example, deployment slots. Some of you may have heard of blue-green deployments, right? That means you want to basically deploy to one staging area first and check if everything's working, and then do a swap between the one that's live in production, right? If anything happens, if something goes wrong, if there's a production issue at that point, then you can simply swap back. So that is what deployment slots does. You can create more than one slot here. Like in my case, I created production, development, and staging, and at any point in time I can do a swap. And when I do a swap, the nice thing here is, the let's say my testing team, or the team, right? Not just if you're cross-functional, you don't have a testing team. The team has tested my staging environment. You know, everything's working. Test cases have passed, automated testing are checked, everything's okay, right? Now, there are always a lot of risk, or some level of risk, when you redeploy to production. So the idea of blue-green testing is, why don't you just redirect or use the staging environment that you have already validated and direct the production traffic to that staging environment, right? And then the old production, you make that into staging. So they swap their rules. So this is what this is doing. When you swap, it will move your, for example, my source could be staging and my target is production, right? Then I can do a swap between these two, and it's a almost zero downtime. Uh, Actually, other than maybe some authentication, I think even authentication will work actually. There's some certain maybe states that may be lost in that point, right? Depending on the application. But when you do a swap, usually it's very seamless for the users. It's almost zero downtime when you do a swap. They don't even notice that they have migrated to the new version. Okay, so what you will see here is before you perform a swap, it does give you a preview of uh, config settings that may be changed, right? And there is a way to configure whether you want the setting to swap as well or not. For example, database connection strings for the staging environment and the production environment, typically you do not want to swap those settings, right? So there's a way for you to configure that so that the connection strings don't get swapped, but maybe certain variables will get swapped. Okay. Yeah, and some other choices here that you can do is, instead of doing a full swap, you can say, can I just test 20% of my traffic? Can I say, before I do a full production deployment, can I say every 1 out of 5 users who access my website, can they first go to the staging environment? Let's gather some telemetry. Let's see if everything's working. If everything's working, then we do a full swap, right? And that's really what this capability does. And you'll see all of this are built into Azure App Services. Without you or networking team, at least in my experience, I've done some traditional deployments before where we had a network engineer had to go to the data center to basically configure the load balancer to drain users from one node to another when we were performing an upgrade. So that was a very tedious effort from a traditional on-prem server perspective. But with this one, it solves your problem, right? It's very easy to do. There are other capabilities here that you will see. For example, configurations. Let me just go through some of them, right? So configurations is basically the settings. Backups is a good one, right? How do you also back up your application code that's deployed in production? That's something that you can configure from here, right? And of course, there's the monitoring, right? There's the what we call application insights, right? So application insights, oh, it's not turned on, right? But let me talk about it. Application insights is like your server, is your web app telemetry for the developers. There are other analytics platforms, web analytics platforms, which is really about how many page views, how many page counts, how many unique users from which geography. But application insights is like your global log collector that will look at not just the telemetry, like how many users and from which geo, but it will capture any JavaScript errors, any server errors, and it will give you an idea of what's happening in your app. Now, this application insights, when you get alerts, you could integrate it to your DevOps platform as well. And for example, when an operations team receives a bug, they can trigger an alert and then log a bug ticket in that DevOps platform, right? So this is like just one example of a capability within Azure that can do DevOps, right? Now, going back to the slide. By the way, I'm looking at the questions as well. Feel free to type in your questions if you have any. Yeah, and I think the host will let me know if there's a chat message. Okay, so there are many Azure services, as I mentioned. Now, the tricky part though is that depending on the Azure service, or really depending on the technology that you use, the way you do DevOps might be slightly different. There are some concepts that are the same, like having a repo, doing CI/CDs, using Monitor, but the way you do the actual CI/CD may be different, right? For example, this is using Data Factory. Data Factory is one of the Azure services where you can do ETL as a service, any type of data processing, moving from one source to a target, you can use Data Factory, right? But the code there, how do you do DevOps on it, right? And so I just called it Data Ops because now it's about data, and so what we did here is we at least published in all of our services. If you go to our documentation website, we would have recommended how you could do CI/CD for that service, whether it be Data Factory in this case, or even machine learning, right? This is another example, machine learning. And I have another example, which is about Azure Synapse, which I just didn't put the slide here, right? But even with the machine learning, we have made sure we have developers first, we have DevOps in mind, and we made sure that we are capable of meeting your needs when it comes to automation. So for example, in machine learning here, you will see that you may be using a repo, and you use, in this case, the reference architecture uses Azure pipelines. This is similar to GitHub Actions. And using Azure pipelines, you could push the container in a container registry. But at the same time, the data scientist can use a Jupyter notebook and basically use different things as well, right? So we publish all this guidance, and there's like an idea here that will help you practice this within your organization. So earlier I talked about DevOps, and then there's Data Ops, which is about using the data factory, right? Now it's about ML Ops, using machine learning. Okay, so many different scenarios here, but all of this similar to earlier. There's another link here, which is a link to how you can do DevOps with Azure machine learning. Okay, so um, we talked about DevOps, data ops, and ML ops. There are other things, right? So DevOps has become such a revolution that many organizations practice it in their own different ways. In some cases, you may have heard of using of DevSecOps. DevSecOps is about moving or integrating security into your software delivery process, so that security is scanned and reviewed and looked at even early on, right? And that is what they call shift left. So DevSecOps is another one, and some will say there's also what they call it, biz DevOps, which is about automating and making sure all the business reports and dashboards, everything is made available to the business on the fly, right? So many different applications, and what Azure does is we made sure that we can fit those different scenarios by giving you certain capabilities. Before I show like the general things that are available in Azure, let me just go through one more set of capabilities. And earlier I kept mentioning that Azure, when I mentioned Azure, I termed it Azure Hybrid Cloud. Now, something interesting about Azure is that, let me just maybe go to that slide again. Um, this one. Okay. So Azure is not a public cloud. It is a hyperscale hybrid cloud. What that means is, when our strategy within Azure is that you don't use it just as a public cloud vendor, you use it for any of your hybrid cloud capabilities, because we recognize that you as a customer, you may be using you're always, or most of the time, you will be in some type of hybrid situation. You'll have on-premise and cloud, right? And even with cloud, you will have multiple clouds, and maybe more than the public cloud providers. You may even be using a lot of SaaS services like Salesforce, or other services like Microsoft 365 is another one, right? So how do you bring them all together, and how do you manage this complex hybrid environment? And that is one of those things that we've constantly been trying to improve within Azure and provide to you as a service. One of those is what we call Azure Arc. Azure Arc is a capability in Azure. I think it was announced 1 2 years ago, where we are now able to bring certain services to your hybrid cloud environment. Basically, whether you're using Windows, CentOS, SUSE, Red Hat, AWS Linux, which is a VM in AWS, this is Ubuntu, right? When you, for example, install an Azure Arc agent within there, right, you are then able to take advantage of these services such as Azure Defender, Sentinel Monitor. Now, Monitor is a big one because you're now able to monitor your hybrid cloud environment in a single pane of glass. Okay, so that's Azure Arc enabled servers. And Azure Arc brings in many other capabilities. It's not just for virtual machines or servers. You can deploy it to SQL Server, for example, right? You can use it to actually manage your on-prem SQL Server or a SQL Server VM in another cloud. You can also enable your Kubernetes cluster with Azure Arc. So what you will see here is that any infrastructure, any Kubernetes, we are able to basically connect or Arc enable that cluster. And with that, you are able to have these capabilities listed here, right? About configuration, operations, monitoring, governance, and security, right? So in a nutshell, what that looks like then is you have your Azure portal, you have your monitoring dashboards within Azure. But when you look at this dashboard now, you're not just looking at your Azure services, but you're also looking at your other clouds, including private cloud servers, and you see all of them in a single pane of glass. So this is one of we've been doing a lot of POCs, and a lot of customers are really very interested in this, really to Arc enable different on-prem and hybrid cloud services, right? Now, more than just management and operations, and I talked about security as well, right? We also enable a couple of things, especially for Kubernetes or Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, right? One of them is GitOps. So when you have an Arc-enabled Kubernetes, whether it be in GKE, in EKS, in Rancher, or any Kubernetes infrastructure, when you Arc-enable them, you are then now able to do a multi-cloud GitOps flow. You are able to use Azure Arc basically to deploy your Helm charts into this all these environments, right? So this makes it a lot easier for you to do GitOps and manage all these different clusters that you see here. But yeah, so that's the idea here, and this is actually my last slide. Now, when earlier I was talking about many different services within Azure, right? But from a high level, as you know, DevOps, depending on the tool, and a lot of engineers here will agree. Give me the APIs, give me the CLI, and I'll know what to do, right? Use Jenkins, I'll use actions, I'll use whatever tool I'm using, and then I could basically just call those APIs and figure out the automation, right? And that's where Azure comes in, right? We at least ensured that all of our services, whatever service you want to use, whether it be in the app space, in the infra space, in the media or data space or ML or AI, right? They are the REST APIs are available for all of this. There's also something called an Azure CLI, where if you want preferred writing bash commands or command lines, you can use the Azure CLI to perform certain commands on your Azure cloud. Now, we also support infrastructure as code. There are two types to it. There's something called Azure ARM template, Azure Resource Manager template. So that's ARM, and then Terraform, right? So we also support that. You can deploy your landing zones and use infra's code to deploy to Azure. We also have Azure policies. Now, this is very important for you to control your roles. Who has access to what is one. But in Azure policies, you can also go as far as say, okay, I'm empowering my developers, but I'm only restricting them to be able to deploy virtual machines in this particular regions and only these particular VM types. So you can restrict that. In Azure policies, we also expanded it for certain compliance things, right? So there's a list of compliance, global compliance that you might want to adhere to. We have certain templates in Azure policies that you can apply so that your environment is also checked and made sure that they comply against these policies. Azure Monitor, I talked about it earlier, right? Application Insights is one of those components of Azure Monitor, which is about web apps and functions. But it could be about VMs, it could be about your Kubernetes cluster, it could be an activity log of who logs in and who deleted, who created things on Azure, right? So Azure Monitor is a big piece of Azure. But part of it, from a DevOps perspective, there will be alerts, and you can use the Azure Communication Services to basically send you an SMS and email as well. And of course, there are webhooks that you can use to, if you want to automate certain things and let's say self-healing playbooks. Security is another one, very important in DevOps or DevSecOps. Who has access to what? How do you ensure that the person accessing it is can has the permissions to do so? Identity protection is a big one, using multi-factor authentication, having conditional access policies to make sure that they're using a managed device in an allowed location to access your workloads. Um, and I did not cover this, but we have something called Azure Sentinel, which is a cloud native SIEM. So we now have a cloud offering, a cloud SIEM offering. And this Azure Sentinel is something that, again, you can deploy to your multi-cloud environment. Doesn't have to be just Azure. You can, again, deploy it in other clouds or in your on-prem infrastructure, and you now have a cloud native SIEM, which you don't have to manage the infra underneath to take care of your monitoring. Okay, and finally, hybrid, very important, right? When I talk, and I keep repeating this, DevOps on Azure is really not just Azure public cloud. I hope I kind of drove that point. You saw GitHub, you saw monitoring, you saw Sentinel, you saw a lot of, I talked about many different things in even GitOps and Azure Arc. In what Azure DevOps or DevOps on Azure brings to you is that we're able to help you even with your DevOps maturity for your hybrid cloud environment. And that's basically is the last point that I want to bring home before I wrap up. Okay, so that's actually my last slide. Thank you. I don't see any questions at the moment. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to type.